The galactic sovereignty had never lost a war, not once, not in 4,000 years of expansion across the stars. They had broken 100 civilizations. They had burned planets that refused to kneel. They had scattered the ashes of entire species into the void and called it justice. Their fleet was the largest in the known galaxy. Their soldiers were trained from birth. Their weapons were forged in the hearts of dying suns. They were, in every sense of the word, unstoppable. So when the outer sensors of the sovereignty's frontier station picked up a new signal from a distant arm of the Milky Way, nobody panicked. The station commander, a tall and decorated officer named Vethanra, leaned over the data terminal and looked at the readings with the same bored expression he gave to everything. "Another primitive world," he said, taking a slow sip from his drink. "Tag it, send a probe, begin classification." The probe was sent. It took 11 months to reach the signal source. When it arrived and began transmitting data back, Vethanra was eating his lunch. He glanced at the initial report, read the first 3 lines, and nearly choked. The planet was called Earth. According to the probe, the species that lived there called themselves humans. They were bipedal, soft-skinned, and breathed a thin mix of nitrogen and oxygen. They had no natural armor, no claws worth nodding, no venom, no scales. They lived short lives by galactic standards, rarely more than 100 of their years. Their homeworld was small, slightly wet, orbiting a single yellow dwarf star. By every measurement the sovereignty used to evaluate civilizations, humans ranked somewhere between irrelevant and barely worth the paperwork. What made Vethanra stop chewing was not any of that. It was the weapons. The probe had intercepted communication signals, scanned surface structures, and analyzed energy signatures. The humans, in their short existence as a species, had managed to build nuclear fission and fusion devices. They had thousands of them, pointed in every direction, at each other. They had spent a significant portion of their history trying to figure out better ways to kill themselves, and in doing so had accidentally become quite good at killing in general. The probe also detected early faster-than-light research, experimental, rough, but real. Vethanra filed the report and forwarded it to High Command with his usual recommendation. Recommend standard contact protocol. Species likely to submit upon first display of sovereignty military force. High Command agreed. They always agreed. That was how it worked. A fleet was assembled. Not a large one. That would have been an insult to the admirals who commanded the big fleets. This was a small, clean, efficient group of 30 warships. The kind of fleet you sent to a backwater world to remind it that resistance was pointless. The kind of fleet that had brought a dozen other species to their knees in the last century alone. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Shevak Dunn, a hard-faced woman with a long list of victories and a short list of patience. She had crushed the Korvathi in 16 days. She had ended the Malan resistance in under a week. She had once accepted the full surrender of a planetary government before she had even finished her morning briefing. She read the file on humans the night before departure. "Primitive," she said to her aide. "We will be back before the season ends." The fleet jumped into faster-than-light travel and began the long crossing toward the edge of the galaxy where Earth waited, small and blue, and completely unaware that its time had apparently come. It took them 14 months to reach the outer boundary of the human solar system, long by sovereignty standards, but the galaxy was wide and the frontier was far. When they dropped out of FTL on the edge of the solar system, they expected silence. They expected a primitive civilization going about its short, confused life, completely unaware of the universe around it. What they got instead was a transmission. It came within 4 minutes of their arrival. 4 minutes. That meant the humans had detected them almost immediately, faster than most civilizations managed even when the sovereignty was not trying to hide. Admiral Shevak Dunn looked at the message as it decoded on her screen. Her translator unit ran it through in seconds. The message read, Unidentified vessels, you have entered sovereign space of the United Earth Confederation. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. You are being tracked. Have a nice day. Shevak Dunn stared at the last line for a moment. Have a nice day. She did not know whether that was a greeting, a threat, or something in between. She decided it did not matter. She recorded a response and sent it, the standard one, the one she had sent a dozen times before to a dozen different species. People of this world, you are now under the jurisdiction of the galactic sovereignty. Resistance is not advised. Submit your planetary leadership for formal transfer of governance within 48 hours and your population will be spared. Refuse, and we will demonstrate the consequences. This is your only warning. She leaned back in her command chair and waited. The response came in 6 minutes, still fast, uncomfortably fast. It was not a surrender. It was not a plea. It was a question. Can you repeat that? Our translators caught most of it, but we want to make sure we understood correctly. Did you just tell an entire planet to surrender or be destroyed? We want to be sure before we respond formally. Also, who are you exactly? You're not in our records. Shevak Dunn frowned. She had never been told she was not in records before. The galactic sovereignty had records in every database on every known world. They made sure of it. They sent missionaries of information ahead of their fleets for exactly this reason, so that when they arrived, everyone already knew to be afraid. She sent back a more detailed response. She included the sovereignty's full designation, a list of conquered civilizations, and a condensed history of the last 4,000 years of galactic dominance. The reply from Earth came 8 minutes later. Thank you, we have reviewed the information. We do not recognize the authority of the galactic sovereignty over Earth or any human colony. We are prepared to open diplomatic negotiations if you are interested. If not, please be advised that our defense systems are active, and we are fully prepared to respond to any hostile action. Also, our records still don't show you. How large is this sovereignty exactly? There was a quiet on the command deck of the flagship. One of the junior officers cleared his throat. Admiral, they asked how large we are. I heard them, Shevak Dunn said. Another officer, the intelligence analyst, spoke up carefully. Admiral, their response time is, they're tracking all 30 of our ships, individually. The energy signatures of their tracking systems suggest multiple ground-based arrays and at least 6 orbital platforms we didn't initially detect. Shevak Dunn turned slowly. 6 orbital platforms. At minimum, some of them are heavily shielded. We couldn't see them at first. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back at the transmission display. Send them our full fleet registry. Let them understand what they are facing. The message went. The reply came back in 11 minutes. 30 warships. Understood. For transparency, here is a partial list of Earth's current active defense assets in this solar system. What followed was a list. It was a long list. It included numbers that made the intelligence analyst go pale. It included weapons platforms, automated defense grids, guided munition stockpiles, rapid response fighter wings, and something described simply as long-range deterrent systems that the analyst could not immediately identify but did not like the sound of. There was a footnote at the bottom of the list. The footnote said, "This is the local defense. Our wider Confederation military assets are not included here as they are not currently in this system. We can provide a full briefing if negotiations proceed." Admiral Shevak Dunn read the list 3 times. She had never read a list like that from a species that the sovereignty had not already classified as a major power. She pulled up the original probe report. She read it again. Soft-skinned, short-lived, small planet, early FTL research. She looked at the date on the report, 14 months ago. "Get me a new scan," she said quietly. "Full spectrum, everything." The scan came back in 20 minutes. The analyst delivered the results personally, standing at her side, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. Admiral, in the 14 months since the probe's visit, they've launched 3 new orbital defense platforms. They have 2 construction stations in the asteroid belt that are active, very active. The energy output suggests heavy manufacturing, and their FTL signature, it's no longer experimental, it's operational. They have ships with working FTL drives. Shevak Dunn looked at the analyst. In 14 months. Yes, Admiral. She was quiet for a very long time. The humans sent another message while she was thinking. We notice you haven't responded. We want to assure you that we prefer a peaceful resolution if one is available. However, we want to be clear, we will defend ourselves if necessary. We've fought wars before. We're not especially fond of them, but we're not frightened of them either. Please let us know how you'd like to proceed. Shevak Dunn read it. She read it again. She thought about the word before. They had fought wars before, as if war was something that had happened to them and they had simply survived it, as if it was an old story and not a threat. She had fought species that begged. She had fought species that screamed. She had fought species that went silent in terror. She had never fought a species that sounded like they were being patient with her. Prepare for contact, she said finally. I want a full tactical review before we take any action. Something about this situation requires more information. The tactical review took 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, the mood on the flagship had changed. It had gone from routine confidence to something quieter, something more careful. Because the more the sovereignty systems looked at Earth, the less it looked like a target. And the more it looked like something else entirely. Something they did not have a word for yet. Something that, for the first time in 4,000 years of unbroken conquest, made a sovereignty admiral hesitate. Outside the viewport, the small blue planet turned slowly in the dark, patient, watchful, waiting. It did not look like a world that was afraid. It looked like a world that had been through worse. And that, more than any weapon on the list, was what made Admiral Shevak Dunn decide she needed to make a very careful phone call back to High Command before she did anything at all. High Command did not take the news well. Grand Marshal Tovenkal received Admiral Shevak Dunn's report in the middle of a formal dinner. He was midway through a glass of wine when his aide brought the message. He read it at the table, which he never did. He set down the glass, which he also never did. He excused himself from the dinner, which he had not done in years. In his private office, he read the report 3 more times. Then he called in his senior staff. They gathered within the hour, 12 of the most powerful military minds in the galactic sovereignty, people who between them had overseen the conquest and absorption of 49 civilizations. They stood around the large table in the war room and listened to Tovenkal summarize what Shevak Dunn had sent. When he finished, the room was quiet. How big is their military? Asked Fleet Marshal Oriundes, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for never asking a question twice. We don't know the full extent yet, Tovenkal said. What we know is what they chose to share, and what they chose to share was already more than a 30-ship force should have to deal with. They chose to share, Oriundes repeated, meaning they showed us a portion of it. That appears to be the case. The room was quiet again. Intelligence Director Mivasal, small, sharp-eyed, known for speaking carefully, placed her hands on the table. The probe report was 14 months old. We sent a contact fleet to a world based on a 14-month-old snapshot. In that time, they advanced their FTL technology from experimental to operational and expanded their orbital defense infrastructure significantly. Yes, Tovenkal said. How fast do they build? Fast enough that it concerned Shevak Dunn, and she is not a woman who is easily concerned. Another silence, then Oriundes spoke again. What does she recommend? Tovenkal looked down at the last line of the report. She recommends we do not engage until we have a complete intelligence picture. She also recommends we send a diplomatic envoy and delay any military action indefinitely. He paused. She calls it, and I am quoting directly, the most unusual first contact situation in my career, and I have no desire to be the admiral who started a war we didn't finish. That statement alone told everyone in the room something important. Shevak Dunn had never said anything like that in her life. What do we know about their history? Asked civilian advisor Pelharn, the only non-military person in the room and usually the quietest. Their actual history, not just military capability. Tovenkal activated the display table. Data from the probe's communication intercepts and surface scans filled the air above it. They call themselves humans. Their recorded history, the part they write down and study, spans roughly 5,000 of their years. In that time they have had hundreds of wars. Major ones, small ones, regional ones, global ones. They developed weapons capable of ending their own civilization at least twice over, and somehow managed not to use them. They survived multiple periods of extreme disease, natural disaster, and what appears to be voluntary economic self-destruction. And then they rebuilt each time. He let that sit for a moment. They survived themselves, Mivasal said quietly. Yes, and the thing about a species that has spent thousands of years trying to kill itself is that it becomes very, very good at not dying. Back in the solar system, Admiral Shevak Dunn was having her own meeting. She had requested a direct communication channel with whoever represented the Human Confederation, and the humans had set one up within the hour, efficiently, with a politeness that she still found deeply unusual. The person on the other end of the channel was a human woman, middle-aged by human standards, Shevak Dunn guessed, though it was hard to tell with a species that aged so fast. She had steady eyes and an unhurried way of speaking that reminded the Admiral, irritatingly, of herself. "My name is Secretary Amara Ndidi," the human said. "I speak for the United Earth Confederation in matters of external affairs. I understand you command the vessels currently at the edge of our solar system. I am Admiral Shevak Dunn of the Galactic Sovereignty's 4th Contact Fleet. Admiral, I appreciate you agreeing to talk. Can I ask you something directly?" Shevak Dunn raised an eyebrow. In her experience, the species she contacted did not usually open by asking to ask questions. They usually opened by asking for mercy. "You may ask. Are you here to conquer us, or was that your opening offer in a negotiation?" The Admiral paused. It was a very precise question. It was our standard opening contact procedure. "So it's what you say to everyone." "It has been effective in the past." Ndidi nodded slowly. "I see. I want to be transparent with you, Admiral, because I think it saves time. We've been aware of signals from beyond our solar system for about 60 years. We've been building our defense infrastructure with that in mind. We hoped we'd have longer before someone showed up, but we've been preparing." Shevak Dunn leaned slightly forward. "You knew someone would come." "We hoped someone might come peacefully. We planned for the other possibility." "And if we choose the other possibility?" Ndidi was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Not out of fear, Shevak Dunn noted, out of thought. "Then we fight. We would prefer not to. Wars are expensive and they kill people, and we've had quite enough of both. But we have fought before, against enemies much closer to home than you are. We are still here. You are aware of the scale of the sovereignty. You sent us your history. We read it overnight. It's impressive. It's also, if you'll forgive me, a long list of victories against people who didn't expect you. We expected you, and we've been working on this problem for a long time." There was a pause on the Admiral's end. "What do you want from this conversation?" Shevak Dunn asked. "I want to understand if there is a version of this where nobody dies today," Ndidi said simply. "If there is, I'd like to find it. If there isn't, I'd like to know that too so we can stop pretending." The Admiral stared at the screen for a moment. Then she said something she had never said in a first contact situation before. "I need to consult with my superiors before I can answer that question honestly." Ndidi nodded. "Take the time you need, we'll be here." The channel closed. Shevek turned to her tactical officer. "Get me a complete passive scan of everything in this system. I want to know what we missed the first time." The scan ran for 6 hours. When the results came back, the tactical officer brought them to the Admiral's private office and placed them on the desk without a word. He then stood quietly, waiting. Shevak read through the data. The humans had 3 active shipyards, not stations, shipyards, 2 in the asteroid belt, 1 in orbit around the large gas giant they called Jupiter. All 3 were producing vessels. The designs were unlike anything in the Sovereignty's database, which meant they were human originals, developed without any access to galactic technology. There were also 17 orbital defense platforms, not 6. The others had been harder to detect because they ran on what appeared to be a novel energy containment system. The Sovereignty's sensors had partially misread as background radiation. And there was a fleet. Not large by Sovereignty standards, but it existed. 43 ships of varying sizes, positioned at multiple points through the solar system, not clustered together, spread out, strategically, as if someone who understood naval doctrine very well had placed them deliberately to cover every approach vector. Shevak had taken the same course in her first year, at the Sovereignty's War Academy. "Who taught them that?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer. The tactical officer gave one anyway. "According to the intercepts, Admiral, they figured it out themselves. Their military strategists have been publishing theoretical papers on multi-vector solar system defense for about 30 years. They've been running simulations, war games, testing approaches." He paused. "They've been preparing for us, not us specifically, but for something like us." Shevak closed the report. She thought about the Korvathi who had begged. She thought about the Malan who had screamed. She thought about the 48 other species whose flags now flew beneath the Sovereignty's banner, not because they had fought and won, but because they had not known what was coming until it was already there. She thought about Secretary Amara Ndidi saying, with complete calm, "We expected you." "Send a full report to High Command," she said. "All of it. The scans, the conversation, everything, and include my assessment." "What is your assessment, Admiral?" She was quiet for a moment. "That we are not dealing with a primitive world. We are dealing with a world that has been quietly becoming something else entirely, and we need to decide very carefully what we do next." Back at High Command, Grand Marshal Tovenkal had reached a similar conclusion through a different route. Intelligence Director Mivasal had spent the night running projections. She came to him at dawn with a single document. It was not long. It did not need to be. "If the Admiral's scans are accurate," Mivasal said, "and if the humans have been building at the rate the data suggests, then in 10 years, their years, not ours, they will have a fleet that rivals our 3rd expansion force." Tovenkal looked up from the document. 10 years. At their current rate of production, and their rate has been accelerating. They have been getting faster each year, not slower. "What happens in 20 years? Mivasal said nothing for a moment. Then, "The projections stop being useful at 20 years. The variables become too uncertain. Their growth curve does not follow a normal development pattern." "What pattern does it follow?" She folded her hands on the desk. "It follows the pattern of a species that knows it's behind and is running to catch up." Tovenkal sat very still. "They've known about the wider galaxy for 60 years, he said slowly, "and they've been building the whole time." "Yes. While we were looking at them as a primitive contact case." "Yes." He set down the document. He picked up his communicator. He opened a channel to Admiral Shevak. Do not engage, he said. Under any circumstances, open diplomatic channels. I am sending a full envoy team. And tell them, he paused, choosing the words carefully, tell them we received their message and we would like to talk. And if they ask what changed our mind. He thought about that for a moment. Tell them we did our research, he said. The diplomatic envoy arrived 6 weeks later. It was a large ship. The sovereignty always sent large ships when it wanted to make a point about power. This one was a deep space cruiser that had been repurposed as a diplomatic vessel, converted cabins, meeting halls, formal dining rooms, but the guns were still there. They always left the guns. The envoy team was led by an ambassador named Sarek Vaughn, a thin, careful man who had negotiated treaties across 14 star systems and had never once failed to bring a world into the sovereignty's fold. He had an aide, 2 translators, 6 advisors, and a security detail of 20 soldiers who wore their dress uniforms but carried full weapons. What Sarek Vaughn had not expected was the human greeting party. The humans had offered a station, one of their orbital platforms, as a neutral meeting point. Sarek Vaughn had accepted. When his shuttle docked and the airlock opened, he stepped through and found 12 humans waiting for him. They were diverse in the way that startled most galactic visitors to Earth. Different heights, different skin tones, different facial structures. It took a moment to register that they were all the same species. They wore formal clothing. They were smiling, which the briefing documents had told him meant something positive in human culture. The one who stepped forward was Secretary Ndidi. She was shorter than he expected from the video transmissions. She extended a hand. The briefing documents had covered this too. He shook it. Ambassador Sarek Vaughn, she said, welcome to human space. We're glad you came. Secretary Ndidi, he replied, we are glad to be here under improved circumstances. She smiled, diplomatic of you. They moved to the meeting hall. The humans had set it up carefully, a long table, chairs on both sides, water and food items appropriate for both species biology. Someone had done research, significant research. Sarek Vaughn noticed the small details. The lighting was adjusted to a level comfortable for sovereignty eyes. The gravity was set to a midpoint between the 2 species' preferences, the temperature balanced. These were the details that showed preparation. That showed thought. That showed, in ways that were hard to articulate but easy to feel, that the humans had been ready for this conversation before it began. They talked for 3 days. Sarek Vaughn had expected resistance at the beginning and eventual submission at the end. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. You showed the power, you listed the alternatives, you offered the terms, you waited for the species to calculate the math and reach the inevitable conclusion. The humans did not follow the pattern. They asked questions. Detailed, intelligent, precise questions about how the sovereignty was governed, how member worlds were treated, what autonomy was preserved after absorption, what trade arrangements looked like, what happened to species that tried to leave. They asked about historical cases. They referenced specific events from the file Shevak Dunn had sent, events that had happened centuries ago, which they had apparently read overnight and retained well enough to cite accurately. At the end of the first day, Sarek Vaughn retired to his cabin and sat quietly for a long time. His aide knocked on the door. How is it going? They are not negotiating like a species that wants to survive, Sarek Vaughn said. They are negotiating like a species that wants a good deal. His aide stared. Is there a difference? Yes, a species that wants to survive will accept almost anything. A species that wants a good deal thinks it has options. On the second day, the humans laid out what they called their counter-framework. Sarek Vaughn had never heard that phrase in a first contact context before. Typically, there was no counter-framework. There was the sovereignty's offer and then there was agreement. The human counter-framework was thorough. It proposed a treaty of mutual recognition rather than absorption. It outlined terms for trade, for travel between territories, for shared defense arrangements against common threats, for cultural exchange programs. It included a detailed economic analysis of what both sides stood to gain, which was, Sarek Van had to admit, more than he had expected. It also included, in quiet and careful language buried near the end of the document, a section headed Security Arrangements. This section listed, in broad terms, the current defensive capacity of the United Earth Confederation. Not as a threat, it was specifically not framed as a threat. It was framed as context for the mutual benefit calculation. Sarek Van read the numbers. He read them again. He called for a private recess. In the back room allocated to the sovereignty delegation, he gathered his advisors and spread the document on the table. "Look at this section," he said, pointing to the security arrangements. His chief military advisor, a retired captain named Telek Far who had been included specifically because he understood force calculations, scanned the numbers. His expression did not change visibly, but his posture shifted, just slightly. "Is this accurate?" Sarek Van asked. Telek Far was quiet for a moment. "The orbital platform count aligns with what the Admiral's scans found. The fleet numbers are larger than the scans suggested. If they've continued building at the same pace, they may have added units in the last 6 weeks." "They're still building." "It appears so." Telek Far folded his hands. "Ambassador, I want to be direct with you. A 30-ship contact fleet was sent here on the assumption that this was a minor world. That assumption was incorrect. If High Command had known what we know now, they would have sent a different fleet, a much larger one, and even then," he stopped. "Even then what?" Telek Far looked at the document. "Even then, it would not have been straightforward. They have defensive systems we haven't fully analyzed. Their ship designs use hull configurations we don't have models for, and they have been running war games for decades simulating exactly this scenario. They have not been sitting still. They have been practicing." Sarek Van looked at the ceiling. In 40 years of diplomacy, he had used the phrase, "the math is clear," many times. It was usually clear in one direction. "What does the math say?" he asked quietly. "It says," Telek Far replied carefully, "that engaging this species militarily would be a serious undertaking. Not impossible, but serious. And the longer we wait, the more serious it becomes." Sarek Van returned to the negotiating table. On the 3rd day, the humans did something unexpected. They invited the sovereignty delegation to take a tour. Not of their planet, they hadn't offered a surface visit. They offered a tour of the orbital station they were currently on, and of one of their shipyards, viewable from a shuttle. Sarek Van accepted. He was curious, and curiosity had always served him better than caution in his career. The station was impressive, not because of its size, it was smaller than many sovereignty stations, but because of how well it worked. Everything was efficient. Everything had a purpose. The humans who ran it moved with the practiced ease of people who had been doing their jobs for years and were good at them. The shipyard was something else. The shuttle passed close enough to get a clear view of 2 vessels under construction. They were large, not as large as sovereignty dreadnoughts, but large. And the construction was fast. There were humans and automated systems working simultaneously, in a rhythm that looked almost organic, each part of the process moving without pause into the next. Sarek Van watched a section of hull plating get fitted in less than 3 minutes by a team of 6 workers and a crane system. "How long does it take to build a vessel that size?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The human liaison beside him answered without hesitation. "That class, about 11 months from keel to launch. We've gotten better at it. 2 years ago it was 16 months. Sarek Van said nothing. 11 months. He knew how long the sovereignty took to build a comparable vessel. He did not say that number out loud. Back at the station, Secretary Ndidi met them for a final conversation before the day's formal session ended. She poured drinks, human tea, which Sarek Vaughn had tried the previous day and found surprisingly tolerable, and sat across from him with the same even expression she had worn since the first handshake. "What do you think?" she asked. It was such a direct question that he almost laughed. "I think you are a more complex situation than we expected." "Most things are." She held her cup in both hands. "Can I be honest with you, Ambassador, not as Secretary of External Affairs, just as a person who has been in this room for 3 days? Please. We don't want to be absorbed into your empire. We've worked too hard and too long to become what we are to hand it over, but we also don't want a war. Wars are terrible. We know that better than almost anyone." She paused. "What we do want is to be known, to be part of something bigger. We've been alone in this universe our whole history. We've been looking out at the stars wondering if anyone was there. And now someone is here. That's actually remarkable. We'd like to make something good out of it if we can." Sarek Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. He had negotiated with fearful species. He had negotiated with angry ones. He had negotiated with species so desperate they agreed to anything just to have the conversation end. He had never negotiated with a species that seemed genuinely, sincerely interested in the outcome being good. "I will need to consult with High Command," he said. "Of course," Ndidi said. "Take the time you need, we'll be here." It was the same thing she had said to Admiral Shevak Dunn 6 weeks ago, the exact same phrase, calm, patient, unhurried. Sarek Vaughn filed his report that evening. It was the longest report he had ever sent in his career. It ended with a recommendation he had never made before in 40 years of service. It said, "Do not attempt to absorb this species. Negotiate in good faith. They are not what we thought they were, and the longer we take to understand that, the more complicated this situation becomes. There is an opportunity here, a real one, but only if we take them seriously." He sent it, leaned back, and stared at the dark of space beyond the viewport. Somewhere out there, he knew, High Command was reading the numbers from the scan, reading his report, reading Shevak Dunn's assessment, and starting to understand, as he had, that the galaxy had just become a more interesting place. And that the small blue world turning slowly in the dark was not the simple problem they had assumed. It was something else. Something that required careful thought. Something, perhaps, that required respect. High Command did not act on Sarek Vaughn's recommendation. Not because they disagreed with it. Most of the senior staff, after reading all of the reports, had quietly reached the same conclusion. The situation with Earth was complicated. The humans were more capable than any early assessment had suggested, and a diplomatic path was almost certainly more sensible than a military one. The problem was Grand Counselor Metherek. Metherek was the oldest member of the Sovereignty's ruling council, and had been in power for longer than most of his colleagues had been alive. He had overseen 15 absorptions personally. He had signed the orders that ended 4 civilizations and folded their remnants into the Sovereignty's growing archive of conquered peoples. He believed, with the conviction of a person who had been right many times and had learned the wrong lesson from it, that there was no problem in the galaxy that a sufficient show of force could not solve. He had read Shevak Dunn's report. He had read Sarek Vaughn's. He had listened to Mivasal's projections, and he had concluded something different from all of them. He concluded that they were overthinking it. "One world," he said at the council table, spreading his hands wide. "One small world with ships they built in their backyard shipyards. We have conquered species with larger fleets. We have crushed worlds with better weapons. The Admiral hesitated because she went there expecting a sheep and found a dog. Send a wolf and the outcome changes." Grand Marshal Tovenkal tried to argue. "Counselor, the projections suggest that in." "Projections are guesses dressed in numbers," Metherek said flatly. "We act now from strength, and this ends before it becomes the problem the analysts want to make it." 3 other council members agreed with him. They were older, all of them, and they had the same long record of victories to point to. The math of history was on their side, they felt, and history was a comfortable argument. The order went out. Not to Shevak Dun's 30 ships. That fleet was withdrawn, and the admiral was quietly reassigned, which was the sovereignty's way of acknowledging that she had been right without actually saying so. The new fleet that assembled was a different thing entirely. 240 warships. It was called the Consolidation Fleet, which was a name the sovereignty used for forces sent to end a problem permanently. It had not been assembled in 60 years. The last time it had been used, the target civilization had taken one look at it on their long-range sensors and surrendered before the fleet reached the outer edge of their system. The fleet's commander was Admiral General Vorkes, a man who had never lost a battle. He was not given to doubt, which was why Metheric had chosen him. He was given Shevak Dun's reports and told to read them. He did. He filed them under background context and moved on. 240 ships, he told his command staff. One world, this is not complicated. The Consolidation Fleet jumped to FTL. It took them 3 months to reach the outer boundary of the human solar system. On Earth, Secretary Ndidi was in a meeting when the alert came through. The Long-Range Detection Network, a system they had finished building 18 months ago, just in time, picked up the FTL signatures at maximum range. That gave them 3 months of warning. 3 months was not a lot of time. But it was not nothing. "How many?" she asked, very quietly, when the general finished his briefing. "Our best count is 240 vessels," General Marcus Webb said. He was the head of the Confederation's combined military forces, a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of steady voice that people trusted in a crisis. Larger than anything Shevak Dun's fleet was, much larger. These are warships, real ones. The room was silent for a moment. "So they decided not to negotiate," said one of the ministers. "Or someone decided for them," Ndidi said. She looked at the projection above the table, the bright cluster of FTL signatures moving toward them like a slow tide. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is what we do about it." What followed was 3 months of the most intense preparation in human history. The shipyards did not stop. They accelerated. The military put out an emergency production order that converted every available construction facility, not just the military ones, to defense manufacturing. Civilian shipbuilders who had been constructing transport vessels and mining ships were retooled to produce hulls, weapons systems, ammunition. The 43 ships that had been in the solar system's defense fleet became 51, then 63. By the end of the first month, it was 72, as ships that had been in various stages of completion were rushed to launch. They were not all ready. Everyone knew that. Some of them were barely finished. Some had crews that were a few weeks short of full training, but they were there. There was also the fixed infrastructure. The 17 orbital platforms that Shevak Dun's scans had found were now 23. The new ones were different in design, heavier armament, more armor, built specifically for a battle rather than general defense. The engineers had been working on those designs since the Sovereignty's first contact fleet arrived 14 months ago. General Webb stood in the command center 3 days before the Sovereignty fleet was expected to arrive, looking at the tactical map of the solar system. He had placed his ships the way the old theorists had written about, the way they had practiced in simulations for years. Spread out, covering the angles, using the terrain of the solar system, the gravity wells, the asteroid fields, the gas giants, as part of the defense. "This is not the kind of battle we trained for," said his chief of staff, Admiral Priameda, standing beside him. "No," Webb agreed. "We trained for smaller threats, theoretical ones. The enemy has more than 3 times our number." "Yes. And presumably more experience." "Probably." Maida was quiet for a moment. Then, "So what do we have that they don't?" Webb thought about that. We've been defending this specific system in simulations for 20 years. We know every rock, every gravity shadow, every angle. They don't. He paused. We've also been designing our weapons specifically to fight ships we don't know because we didn't know what was out there. We built for unknowns. They've been fighting species they already had records on, species that used familiar technology. He looked at the map. They've never fought humans before. Is that enough? Webb said nothing for a long moment. Then, it's what we have. Admiral General Voorkes dropped out of FTL at the edge of the solar system, exactly on schedule. He had done this many times. It was a feeling he knew. The moment the stars snapped back into fixed positions, the moment the system opened up on the tactical display, the moment the enemy sensors began to register his presence. He expected the usual response: panic, frantic communications, emergency broadcasts. What he got instead was silence. For almost 7 minutes nothing happened. No transmissions, no defensive movements visible on the long-range sensors, no emergency broadcasts on any frequency. His communications officer frowned. Admiral General, no response from the planet. Keep scanning. Another 3 minutes of silence. Then his tactical officer spoke very quietly. Admiral General, I'm getting returns. There are vessels positioned throughout the system. There, he paused, adjusting the display. They're not where I expected them to be. They're spread across multiple vectors. How many? The officer ran the count twice. Approximately 70 and, another pause, Admiral General, the orbital platforms. I'm getting a much higher count than the previous scout report indicated. How much higher? 23, and they are fully active. Weapons powered. Energy signatures indicate targeting systems online. Voorkes leaned forward slightly. The consolidation fleet had 240 ships. 70 human vessels and 23 platforms was still heavily outmatched. The math was still clear. What was not clear was the silence. Why haven't they said anything? His aide asked quietly. Voorkes did not answer because he did not have an answer. In every battle of his career, the enemy had responded to his arrival with something: fear, anger, desperate communication, emergency transmissions. The silence was wrong. The silence meant they were not panicking. Then the transmission came. A single voice, calm, measured. It spoke in the sovereignty's own language with a slight accent but no significant errors. Admiral General Voorkes, we know your name because we have been monitoring your communications for the last 3 months. We know the size of your fleet, its formation, its fuel state, and the capabilities of your vessel classes. You know considerably less about us. We would like to offer you the choice that your sovereignty chose not to give us. Stand down, withdraw from this system, and tell your leadership that the cost of taking this world is higher than they have calculated. Or proceed. We will respond accordingly. The voice paused. We would genuinely prefer you stand down, but we are ready either way. The transmission ended. The command deck was very quiet. Voorkes looked at the tactical display. At the 70 ships, spread across the system in a pattern he was beginning to understand. A pattern that was designed to deny him easy angles of attack no matter which direction he came from. At the 23 platforms, positioned on the high ground of every gravitational approach. At the asteroid belt, which his navigation systems were flagging as a radar hazard, meaning there might be additional assets hidden in it. He looked at all of it for a long time. Full scan, he said. I want to know what's in that asteroid belt. The scan ran. When the results came back, even Voorkes was quiet for a moment. There were 14 additional vessels in the asteroid belt, running minimal power, waiting. They had been sitting there, powered down, for what the energy residue suggested was weeks. They had laid an ambush. Not a trap born of desperation. A planned, prepared, deliberate ambush, set up before the sovereignty fleet had even arrived. They knew we were coming, his aide said, no longer quietly. They knew where we'd enter the system. They set up a position. Vorkes thought about Shevak Dunn's report, the part he had filed under background context. The part that said, they have been running war games simulating exactly this scenario. He looked at the display for a very long time. Then he made a decision that no Consolidation Fleet Admiral had ever made in the history of the galactic sovereignty. All ships, he said, hold position. And he began to think. Vorkes held position for 4 hours. During those 4 hours, he did something that no Consolidation Fleet commander in the history of the galactic sovereignty had ever done before a battle. He read the full file, every report, every scan, every transcript of every conversation between the humans and the sovereignties, diplomats and admirals, since the first contact probe had found Earth. He read all of it, cover to cover, not skimming, reading. When he was done, he sat for a long time. His aide stood by the door, saying nothing, which was the wisest thing the aide had done in his career. Finally, Vorkes spoke. What is the current status of the human fleet? Holding their positions, Admiral General. No aggressive movements. The asteroid belt vessels are still powered down. The platforms are still hot, but they haven't moved targeting locks onto our lead ships. They're waiting. Yes. Vorkes stood up. He walked to the viewport and looked out at the distant solar system. The yellow star. The small blue point that he could just barely see if he knew where to look. The scattered lights of the human defensive fleet, too small to see but known from the tactical display, spread across the dark in a pattern that no one had drawn up for them, that they had drawn up themselves. He thought about Grand Counselor Metherak. He thought about the word wolf. He thought about the assumption that the enemy would see the wolf and run. The humans had not run. They had seen the wolf coming 3 months in advance, and they had spent those 3 months building more teeth. Open a channel, he said. The communications officer looked up. To the planet, sir. To whoever is in command of their fleet. The channel opened. There was a pause of about 30 seconds, and then a voice came through. It was a woman's voice, steady, tired perhaps in the way someone sounds when they've been awake for a long time, but steady. This is General Webb's command, Admiral General. Deputy Admiral Priya Mehta speaking. What can I do for you? Vorkes had been ready to speak first, but the question gave him pause. It was so normal, so businesslike, as if this were a scheduling call and not 2 fleets staring at each other across the dark. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. When your detection network picked us up 3 months ago, what was the conversation like? On your side? A pause. Why do you want to know that? Because I'm trying to understand what kind of people I'm looking at. Another pause, slightly longer, then Mehta spoke. We were scared. I won't pretend otherwise. 240 ships is a lot of ships. We ran the numbers 100 different ways and most of the models were not comforting. A short pause. But we'd known something like this might come eventually. We'd spent years getting ready. And when the time came, people didn't fall apart. They worked. Everyone worked. We built more. We prepared more. We practiced until our people could run their stations in their sleep. She paused one more time. We were scared, but we were ready. That's the best we can say. Vorkes looked out at the stars. I have 240 ships, he said. You have 84. The math is not on your side. The math we can see isn't, Mehta agreed. But you've been reading reports about us for months. You know our production rate. You know we've been building faster every year. You know that even if you win today, you'll be fighting again in a year and we'll have more then. And the year after that, a pause. We're not going to stop being a problem for you. That's just the truth. The question is what kind of problem we are. Vorkes said nothing. The kind that you have to keep fighting, Mehta continued, or the kind that you eventually work something out with. The channel was quiet for a moment. Your diplomat offered a treaty framework, Vorkes said. We did. The offer is still open. And if I attack today, then we fight, and it will be ugly and expensive, and a lot of people will die, and we will lose some of this system, but we won't give up, and you will not leave here unbloodied." The voice was completely calm, not a boast, not a threat, a statement. "And then you'll have to decide whether to come back, and we'll use the time before you do to get bigger and better, and then we'll do it again and again, until one of us isn't there anymore." A pause. "Or we negotiate, today, before any of this happens. My orders are to consolidate this system. I know, and I'm asking you, Admiral General, to decide whether those orders still make sense given what you know. You've had 4 hours. You've read the file. What do you think?" The channel was silent for a full minute. Then Vorkast said something that would be debated in the Sovereignty's war colleges for generations. He said, "I think my orders were written by someone who didn't read the file." Maida was quiet for a moment, then quietly, without triumph or celebration, "So what do you want to do?" "I want to send a message to High Command," he said, "and I need you to give me enough time to send it and receive a reply." "How much time do you need?" 24 hours. "Done," she said immediately. No hesitation, no conditions, done. The message Vorkast sent to High Command was blunt and exactly as long as it needed to be. He described the tactical situation accurately. He described the human defensive disposition. He described the asteroid belt ambush. He described the conversation with Deputy Admiral Maida. And then he wrote, in plain language, his assessment. "If we engage, we will take this system. We may take it at significant cost. We will not end the problem. The species that builds this fast, that thinks this clearly, that prepares this thoroughly, you cannot conquer them the way we have conquered others. You can beat them back, but they do not stop. They adapt and they return. I have read every report in this file, and I believe, without reservation, that a war with these people is not something we can end on our terms. We can win battles. We cannot win the war, not against a species that has been planning for us longer than we knew they existed." He sent it. Then he went to his cabin, sat in the chair by the viewport, and waited. At High Command, the message landed in the middle of a very different kind of meeting. Grand Counselor Metharak was furious. He called it cowardice. He called it a failure of nerve. He demanded that Vorkast be relieved of command and that the fleet proceed immediately. Grand Marshal Tovenkal said nothing for a long time. Then he asked a question. "If Vorkast is wrong," he said, "and we can take this world, what do we have at the end? One more world in the archive. One more flag under ours. What does it give us that we don't already have?" "It gives us the principle," Metharak said. "It shows the galaxy we do not negotiate with primitives." "They are not primitives," Tovenkal said. He said it simply, without anger. "They haven't been primitives since before we found them. We were wrong about what they were from the beginning. And if we fight them based on being wrong, and Vorkast is right about the cost, then we have spent something we can't get back on a point of pride." He looked around the table. The other council members were quiet. "I'm going to recommend to this council," Tovenkal said, "that we authorize Vorkast to open formal treaty negotiations, that we recognize the United Earth Confederation as an independent entity, that we step back from this situation with our fleet intact and our people alive, and that we spend some time thinking very seriously about what it means that a species we found 14 months ago already has us sitting here asking these questions." The vote was not unanimous. Metharak voted against. 2 others voted against. The rest voted for. Vorkast received the authorization 21 hours after he sent his message. He read it twice. Then he opened the channel to Deputy Admiral Maida. "I have authorization to begin formal treaty negotiations," he said. There was a pause. Then, "We'll notify our diplomatic team. How would you like to proceed?" "Carefully," he said, "and honestly." Another pause. He thought he might have heard something in the background. It might have been a breath let out. It might have been relief. "That works for us," Maida said. What happened in the months that followed was, by later accounts, one of the most unusual diplomatic processes in the galaxy's recorded history. The sovereignty's negotiating team, led this time by Sorek Vaughn, who had been retrieved from his quiet retirement and sent back with an actual mandate, found themselves across the table from humans who had spent 3 months preparing for a war and were now redirecting all of that preparation toward the question of what peace should look like. It turned out that humans were as thorough at making peace as they were at preparing for war. The treaty they eventually reached was unlike any the sovereignty had signed before. It did not absorb Earth. It did not place humans under sovereignty governance. It established a framework of mutual recognition, two separate powers, with defined borders, shared trade routes, and something called a Cultural Exchange Bureau that was the humans' idea and that the sovereignty's cultural historians privately found fascinating. It also included a mutual defense clause, which was the humans' other idea, and which had been quietly debated within high command for weeks before anyone admitted it made sense. Admiral General Vorkes did not attend the signing. He had returned to sovereignty space after the initial negotiation phase and submitted his resignation from the consolidation fleet, which was accepted. He was later appointed to a newly created position, liaison to the United Earth Confederation. It was considered a demotion by some. He considered it the most interesting job he had ever been given. On the day the treaty was signed, Secretary Ndidi stood in a room on the orbital station and watched the final documents go through. When it was done, she stepped outside to a viewport and looked out at the solar system, at the yellow star, at the planets arrayed around it, at the place where, months ago, 240 warships had sat in the dark deciding. Her aide came to stand beside her. "How does it feel?" Ndidi thought about it for a moment. "Like the beginning of something," she said. "I'm not sure what, but something. A good something." She looked out at the stars, not just the familiar ones, but the ones beyond them, the places she now knew held other civilizations, other peoples, other worlds that the sovereignty had touched and that humans might someday reach. "I think so," she said, "if we're careful and smart, and we don't assume the people out there are what they look like at first glance." Her aide was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that what they assumed about us?" Ndidi smiled. "Yes, and they were wrong." She looked at the stars a little longer. "The galaxy is big," she said, "and we're just getting started." Back in the sovereignty's war colleges, the case file on Earth was already being assembled into a curriculum. Officers would study it for decades. The file had a simple heading that someone had written at the top of the first page, a summary, of sorts, of the entire situation. It read, "Not in our records." Which was true. They had not been in anyone's records. They had not been cataloged, classified, or accounted for. They had not been known, anticipated, or prepared for. They had simply been there, on their small blue world, looking up at the stars and building and thinking and preparing and waiting. And when the galaxy finally came to find them, it discovered something it had not expected. Not a primitive world. Not a simple problem. Not a flag to add to a long list of flags. It found humans. And that changed everything.